if you could choose sort of just a couple of things now that you think are easy fixes, where would you go?
In terms of practical changes, key thing that they've got to do, and we were talking about for years, was understanding, get their digital platforms working properly. So you're saying to the regulator, we do 155 things religiously, but we have no process for making sure we do those 155 things religiously. So actually we're only doing 3, and then they find that out after you've killed 72 people in one of your buildings, for example. So in my world, I always assume that nothing's being done until it can be proved that it is. And that's the key difference, because I can't rely on that in court.
Based on conversations we've had today and based on conversations we've had over weeks and months prior to this, I can wholeheartedly say that our primary role in this is to make buildings safer.
Yeah.
I'm joined by Matt Hodges-Long, who has been key in conversations on high-profile networks such as the BBC, Sky News, LBC, etc., on the subject of building safety, talking about building safety cases, talking about golden thread, and we're going to tap into a little bit more of that in this podcast. Matt, welcome. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
Before we get into the nitty-gritty of what we want to discuss today, perhaps you could just give us a short insight as to who you are, what you do, maybe how we work together, and then I've got some questions about how you came to this point.
No problem. Well, so as you said, founder of the Building Safety Register and Track My Risks. We are a strange animal as a software provider, but also helping companies comply with regulatory regimes. So principally, I think most of our conversation today will be around high-rise buildings or higher risk buildings post-Grenfell, but we also work in healthcare, education, financial services, really any industry that has a big scary regulator or a wide requirement for managing evidence of compliance with regulatory regimes. So, all over the place. But I think to answer your initial question, my background is in construction. Yeah. So I started off life as a house builder, working on site and doing my construction degree sponsored through that by a large PLC house builder, and saw the error of my ways for reasons that we'll probably come on to, and went indoors into the warm facility commercial property management through a weird set of events into the very early stages of the internet with a global pharmaceutical company. It does all make sense if I give the long version. Yeah. And then from there into the serviced office market, but new product development for them globally. So that got me into building software platforms and working with partners to do that. And hence, through a number of other strange, weird quirks of fate and sliding door moments, end up here today being one of the largest providers of compliance software into the built environment. So yeah, quite a strange and torturous route.
Well, it sounds interesting, and we'll come back to the software because ultimately that's how we met in terms of how we work and integrate with one another. But going back to how you came about, so you talked about your learning curve in house building. I think that was the case. So was it one specific event? Was it a number of events that brought your attention to building safety, and or sort of a more organic route into your thought process?
Originally it was organic, but looking now, having had a chance to reflect on where did I start sort of thinking about risk and management and also defensibility, so what happens when you end up in a court or whatever, that actually happened towards the end of my very short-lived on-site career, where I ended up rearranging a street of houses and cars with aggregate. We had an accident with a CFA piling rig. I'm assuming the audience will know what that is, but
I think they will.
We were pumping concrete into a hole in the ground, and we ended up kinking a hose and having an explosion of aggregate shot across the road. But the key point for that, aside from property damage, that was a key route for school kids to walk back from the local secondary school.
Okay.
And I think if it had been sort of 15 minutes later, we would have had a completely different outcome to that accident. And it was only sort of looking back on that years later that I thought, I would have been absolutely defenseless at that point as the manager of that site. I'd had no training, very little documentation in place, totally and utterly defenseless. And it sort of came full circle where I was at an event and I was talking to one of the litigators from the HSE. And I asked her this sort of genuine question around, well, what sort of success rate do you get with your prosecutions? And she just laughed at me and said, we never lose. And I said, well, how do you never lose? And she said, well, we only prosecute the cases we're absolutely going to win.
Okay.
And that dawning moment that I thought I would have been in that defenseless category at that point. And that's really probably where the germ of the idea of saying, well, how would an organization at scale defend itself? How does it keep those records? How does it make sure the correct people have seen the correct information at the correct time? And that's really the sort of the genesis of where our Track My Risks platform came from. Which is effectively in our world the golden thread platform, way before Grenfell.
I was just going to touch on that point because I don't know the exact date of that, but I'm assuming that was way before Grenfell, way before the global mental shift into building safety, or certainly the catalyst for that shift.
Yeah.
So that demand's always been there, and especially if you're CFA, you're not even talking a high-rise building at that point. You're very much into the ground. So
yeah,
that developed that sort of thought process, and then that led you into the software side of what you do, did it?
Yeah, well, I'd been through a number of iterations of software before. I mean, sort of originally being responsible for a project in South Korea for a pharmaceutical company, helping or trying to encourage elderly members of society to take their medicine for hepatitis.
Okay.
This is a weird story. It does make sense, but
I like weird stories.
But really, that project taught me really everything that I didn't want to be in my career. I did not want to be doing harm to people, or potentially doing harm. So I enjoyed what we could do on the internet and what we could do with software, etc. But I've always wanted to do something that helps people rather than disadvantages them or hinders them. And that sort of that philosophy has driven me all the way through. So that when Grenfell happened and it started to become apparent that there were gaps in record keeping or understanding of the building, or people were on different pages about different things, I just knew that was the right application that was the application for our software that we'd already built at that point, but were primarily using in financial services and education and other industries, because really the built environment didn't really have a compliance culture at that point. You could argue it probably still doesn't, or it's got a lot further to go, and maybe we'll come on to that as we talk.
Not too quick, Matt.
No, absolutely. But it became apparent that we could do things that helped people, that were beneficial. We didn't have to harm people, etc. And that's really one of the key reasons I got out of the pharmaceutical industry. I just didn't feel comfortable with what we were doing, although I know that they also help a lot of people. Where that meets commerciality can often be a bit difficult. From an ethical perspective.
Yeah, no, sure. Whereas actually, in terms of applying this to the built environment, it can do no harm.
Absolutely,
data is king, and communication, anything to improve communication, education, safeguarding. Yeah. We'll come to that.
But I think on that point, just again reflecting, because I don't spend enough time reflecting, it's really good to talk about it. Is that having had a near miss, or a number of near misses over the years, I think if you do reflect on that, you think, well, what could I have done differently? Okay, as defending myself, but also how would I feel if I was the one that had killed 5 school kids, inadvertently, through not managing risk properly on the site, or rushing, or doing whatever, or cutting corners. And again, in those days in the house building industry, whether it's still the same or not, I couldn't possibly comment. But if you could be creative, cut corners, and get things done on time, that was your ticket to promotion and bonuses and all those sorts of things. Nobody wants in a volume house builder somebody that doesn't meet their deadlines.
Well, I
was very good at meeting mine.
And it's an age-old argument, isn't it, of getting things done properly and then commercial viability. And I think we've seen a culture of that in house building and other projects, where projects are won and then they are cost engineered, shall we say, sort of post-appointment. And that means, doing things in the cheapest way to meet compliance, but compliance being the benchmark rather than quality above compliance.
We've only got to look at Grenfell to see that in action. Well, they didn't even achieve compliance, but the pressure to value engineer, if we were to use that horrible term, and actually build some margin back into a project, and a few £1,000s being the difference between killing people and not killing people is not something that I would want to be involved in personally, but I can understand why it happens.
Well, you can, but it's value engineer at what cost?
Yeah.
And the cost there was the highest possible tariff. It was significant. It was terrible. Just want to go back to your example of what really set your mind thinking. You felt all those things. Where am I in a defence position or lack of defence position? But there's also the wider company to include in that, isn't there? Because you obviously, as a conscientious person, as someone that takes great pride in what you do and worries about these things, but those responsibilities spread far and wide into the wider business. And I think part of the message that I want to relay today is where those accountabilities sit, where people, who needs to listen to this, who needs to worry about what their roles and responsibilities are, and what do they need to do about it. So we'll push into that.
I think where you've got, I would say that in a lot of organisations I work with or come across, the senior management's appetite for risk is not an appetite that I would have, and I think quite often that appetite isn't really discussed. So it's back to your earlier point of, well, what value do you place on a life? How many people are you happy killing or not? And I think I'm renowned for having those really blunt conversations with people that make them sort of go, oh, hang on a minute, I hadn't looked at it's sort of a mindset which is let's wreck something now, let's kill somebody now in a discussion, so that we don't actually do it in real life, and it's that having that grown up conversation, I think, which then makes people think, do you know what, I don't think we're quite managing this as seriously as we should, or we're not putting enough money into this, or whatever, we're not taking this seriously enough. And I certainly had that in house building, where the people that ruled the rules were the sales team. The grubby construction people just got in the way of making sales, basically, and that's where I sort of realised my station was, and I didn't feel comfortable with that.
No, I agree, and I feel that as uncomfortable as those conversations are, they are what are required to form change.
Yeah.
And change is where we're at. We're in a massive transition period in the industry, especially in relation to high-risk buildings. And that's the level of accountability people need to adopt mentally when they're making key decisions.
Yeah.
Mark, you've been involved in the Building Safety Act before it became the Safety Act, I think. Before we get into the schematics of it, tell me your involvement's been to date and how that's affected how you think about things.
Yeah, well, it's so my foray sort of into government policy making or whatever started in round about May 2019, I believe, which was when Dame Judith Hackett's Building a Safer Future report came out. And that's really where the first utterings of golden thread came from, and that way of thinking around record keeping, around safety cases, and how the wider regime would work, and how higher rise or higher risk buildings would be regulated, which, interestingly, at that time, her definition was 30 metres plus. So about 10 stories plus. And then that later got revised down, but that's probably a whole other podcast. So actually, knowing that you've got a solution to this problem, an immediate solution to a big part of this problem, which we had in our Golden Thread Track My Risk platform. It was already 2 or 3 years old at that point. It was mature. It was being used. I naively thought, by going to government and saying, look, this theoretical way of working that Dame Judith has put into a report, we're already doing this. Let's just get it done. This is something that could save lives now. We don't need to wait for this. And that's where this journey of frustration began. It started off very simple with why don't we just start asking everybody to register their fire risk assessments, for example, for all of these buildings? Let's start actually databasing where these buildings are. Let's use effectively a self-certification regime or a self-regulatory regime to actually ask people to come forward. And those responsible people, using the term as responsible people as opposed to the legal term of responsible persons, would turn around, would provide that information. They've got nothing to hide. And then maybe the ones that wouldn't might get greater amounts of attention from the local fire service or whatever. And we can actually start collating this database of information. It can become a government platform for managing building safety information in the same way that we do with car registrations, for example, or MOT information. And it really got either ignored or repelled at every turn. Working with the building safety minister, trying to get past the civil servants, you were never really clear who was actually doing what, but it became apparent after many years of working with them that it just wasn't going to happen. They were going to develop legislation that was massively expensive and over-engineered, to solve the problem, and we're going to ignore the low-hanging fruit that was immediately available. So that's 6 or 7 years of massive frustration. But have had a ringside seat of seeing how policy is developed and how laws are developed and how they're debated, and it's a pretty shonky system, really. It's amazing we get anything done. But here we are.
It sounds like it. It sounds like it must be. It sounds like a lot of red tape, to put it in layman's terms. I think ultimately, and even more frustrating when you sat with the answer.
Well, it's the efficacy of it. I'm I guess a liberal rather than a libertarian, in the sense that there is a place for the state for regulatory intervention, as long as it's effective and it doesn't overreach. And I think in terms of the Building Safety Act, there's quite a bit of overreach going on. And there's a lot of areas that really haven't been addressed, and there hasn't been any enforcement. So we sort of ended up with the worst of all worlds at the moment. And I think everyone's sort of trying to feel their way through to see where can we push, where do we need to focus? Will I get done if I do this or don't do that? Is it worth spending the money? Is it not? It's still very exploratory at the moment rather than being clear.
Yeah, and that's potentially quite dangerous, isn't it? In terms of people pushing boundaries, it's almost like the toddler, isn't it? Seeing how far they can go before they get told off by the parent. And I don't mean that in the literal sense. Obviously, very intelligent people are operating under this criteria, but yeah, it would be nice to have clearer guidelines. I mean, what would you like to see differently if you could choose sort of just a couple of things now that you think are easy fixes? Where would you go?
Well, I think in terms of we are where we are with the regime at the moment, and the fact that it goes from design right the way through to occupation, with a huge number of buildings in scope, just over 13,000 occupied buildings, probably 300 or 400 a year, new ones coming through the pipeline, and then countless numbers of existing buildings that then need notifiable works, whether it's fire door replacements or fire escape stair changes or reconfiguration or whatever it is. It's this mass of activity that the regulator isn't structured to cope with. In terms of practical changes, key thing that they've got to do, and we were talking about for years and being ignored, was get their digital platforms working properly. So at the moment, they're hugely inefficient. And that inefficiency is at the expense of industry and residents, in terms of if they take 100 hours to do 50 hours work, we all pay for the 100 hours, and we do they process half the amount of work that they could if they were efficient, if you see what I mean, just in simple terms. So that side of things, enforcement, visible enforcement, whether there is some that's going on privately, I don't know, but certainly public enforcement. And I think in a way, a lot of the clients that we deal with, if there was some public enforcement, it would really help them do the internal sale for budget, for resource, that otherwise I use the analogy of the sort of the double yellow lines, that we're painting double yellow lines all over the town centres, but we're not paying for any traffic wardens.
Tickets on.
Yeah, so people just ignore. It's even worse than not having the double yellow lines, because people are just parking where they want. So enforcement, the technology, and then the other key thing is, I think they need to be communicating and sort of sharing best practice and sharing worst practice. So we've got a bit of that going on with Cross in terms of the collaborative reporting. But I've been on the record many times talking about it. A real poster child for me is the Spectrum fire down in Dagenham or Dagenham, sorry, in August 24. So a building just into the higher risk regime at 7 stories, going through a remediation project, completely scaffolded with wooden planks, total loss fire, 20 people led out with smoke hoods on by London Fire Brigade. There is still no incident report in the public domain. There's no learning points that have been shared, no prosecutions, not a peep from the regulator, not a peep really from London Fire Brigade. And really, I think, to me, that was the opportunity to say, this is what we learned from it. This is what we're doing in terms of the principal accountable person, or not doing for these reasons. This is the regime in action. And at the moment, a year and a bit later, tumbleweed.
No action.
Yeah.
setting a precedent of consequence.
There's no peril that at the moment.
Yeah.
There's no peril really. There's theoretical peril, which we'll probably talk about. But what is the actual peril for non-compliance or just completely ignoring the post-Grenfell regime?
Interesting. Really interesting. I've got 1,000 questions around that, but
Okay.
I'll keep on track just a little bit. But yeah, it is. It's almost setting a speed limit without any cameras, isn't it?
Yeah.
That does render the question, what's the point?
Well, even if you use that analogy and you have a huge crash and there were no cameras, then what investigation happens after the accident? So you've avoided or missed the opportunity to avoid the incident. Now the incident's happened. What is the retrospective consequence? And again, if we look at Spectrum as at the moment, nothing. Now, will that happen in the future? I don't know. I remember clearly the dearly departed building safety regulator. I've forgotten his name now. The one that might have been Philip White, but anyway, he sort of said, "Well, we're going to be a regulator with teeth, and people better not take advantage of us, etc., etc." He said that at a conference, building safety regulators conference, and then within about 3 weeks, abruptly retired. Now, I haven't seen those teeth yet, and actually, I shared a picture of me talking 6 years ago, doing a presentation, and there was a picture of HSE logo and Ofsted and a few others, and then a big picture of a wolf, snarling teeth. And I remember at the time saying, what we need is a regulator with teeth. This is before the building safety regulator was even announced.
I think, yeah.
Or a part of the HSE at the time. It's sort of, that's what we need. Not that I want everybody to fall under the regulatory bus, but there has to be some peril, because that's the only way people will take this seriously.
Well, absolutely. If you draw, it's a broad analogy, but draw it against the overarching legal system in which we live, people don't do bad things because it's got the consequences.
Correct.
Are there to stop that from happening. So let's move into practical terms then. So the work that we've been doing together, from my perspective, has been with Fortis and Charter as a building safety consultant, in all aspects. But for the purpose of this, the formation and maintenance of building safety cases, you touched on the numbers just before, circa 11,000, did you say?
Just over 13,000.
Sorry, 13,000 legacy projects, let's call it that, with obviously the new pipeline works coming through at 400 per annum, etc. So anything over 7 stories, 18 metres plus, needs to have a building safety case. It will have been subjected to Gateway 2 or Gateway 3, subject to when it was built, etc., so on and so forth. How fundamentally important to this entire system is the building safety case?
I think in occupation it's the absolute bedrock of, ultimately, I think the way to look at this is your plea to the regulator or to a court or whoever about why is this building safe? So what's it made up of? What are the risks that you're putting people to? How are you managing those risks, and how are you evidencing the management of those risks effectively in a narrative form?
Yeah.
That's your safety case report, which is what the regulator look for. And then underlying that is your wider safety case, which effectively is all of evidence of all of that stuff going on and those processes operating. So, for example, if you say that every month you have a team meeting where you review building safety, for example, nice words, you can put that in your narrative, but where is the evidence of you doing it? But are you actually doing it? So that's all part of your safety management system, and again, there's sort of lots of jargon, but effectively is, what are the risks? What are you doing about them? Making your claims and arguments. Where's the evidence of you doing that? Are you actually doing it? That's effectively your safety case. And then the evidential side of things gets stored in your golden thread, which effectively is a record for the building. And again, that record has to be up to date, has to be secure, has to be portable. Yeah. There are a number of attributes in regulation around the golden thread, but ultimately these things all tie together. And then you have two other parts of the Holy Trinity that the regulator looks for, which is the resident engagement strategy and the mandatory occurrence reporting system.
Yeah.
So when they call your building forward in occupation for assessment, the building assessment certificate process, they will ask for those 3 documents, so the safety case report, mandatory occurrence reporting, resident engagement strategy, to be uploaded into their portal. And then from there, they will come back and request further information with a 7-day producer, if you like. So whenever they ask for it, you've got 7 days to submit your answers to those questions or provide that information, which you will pluck from your golden thread. In simplistic terms.
I think, I just want to pick up on a certain aspect of that, and that's this maintained accountability. We'll touch on who those people are in a minute, but from a practical sense, in terms of what I do, in terms of the way I engage with my client base, I've had several conversations with people, and the way that we present our engagement, if you will, is we will help you develop the building safety case and submit the same, but then we'll maintain that with you. And what I mean by that is, we'll interact with you on a periodic basis. We'll check accountability, make sure systems are being followed, etc. And I've been slightly surprised in a few instances where people have sort of said, well, you're the first person to say that. We've approached various other people and they'll do us a safety case for this amount. And that's it. I think, personally, I don't think that's the right way to go about it. I think the importance is to maintain it, because it's one thing to write something, it's another thing to make sure it works and continues to work. And I know that you've got some examples of situations where people haven't quite followed through on MORs, etc. And that could be, the chain reaction of that could quite literally be deadly. So I suppose the question is, do you agree, and how important is that ongoing maintenance for accountability?
It's absolutely essential, because it's your report is only ever a snapshot in time. So if you employ somebody just as a consultant to come and write a report, they are writing a report, whereas although it's called a report, your safety case report is the narrative about the systems that you operate to keep that building safe. So you're describing recurring actions, and unless you make sure those recurring actions recur, it's actually worse than, in a sense, not doing them at all, because you're giving that false assurance. So you're saying to the regulator, we do 155 things religiously, but we have no process for making sure we do those 155 things religiously. So actually we're only doing 3, and then they find that out after you've killed 72 people in one of your buildings, for example, at the extreme end. So, and the reason you're doing those things is to keep people safe. So effectively, what we've always said to the regulator is that all of those activities can be measured in data and can be supervised in data, which is the whole concept of supervisory technology, which is where originally we thought the regulator would want to go and the government would want to go, which effectively gives you that real-time dashboard of every single high-rise building and its proximate safety. So you could actually then see everything from the one where you could eat your dinner off the floor from a compliance perspective, down to the one that you wouldn't want to set foot in. And I would argue, if you could only make one regulatory visit or intervention, I would go to the one that's at the bottom of the list than at the top. And that was sort of the thinking. Unfortunately, they fumbled the opportunity. Whether they'll come back to it in the future, I'm not sure, but it would require a change in legislation. It
would, but I think it's probably essential. In terms of the quantity of risk that we're talking about, and the vision of the visibility, let's say, of that risk as well. Being able to get a snapshot on higher risk elements is essential. Being able to take action against those elements is prudent, and frankly, you can't do it all, so you've got to prioritise.
And I think the situation is flattered by the fact that, thankfully, and probably with famous last words, the significant loss of life incidents in higher risk buildings, or tall residential buildings, is thankfully very low in this country. They are low frequency, as we can see by Grenfell and incidents since. So if you were a betting person and you ran a portfolio of higher risk buildings, the likelihood is you're not going to be presiding over the next Grenfell. That's entirely different to having systems and processes in place to make sure you're not. So it's that sort of weighted coin analogy, which I use with people, which is you want to make sure that coin lands on the correct face if you flip it in the air. And the way you do that is by weighting one side of the coin, right? So that's what risk management is. Otherwise, you're just riding your luck. And because of the relatively low risk of residential buildings, you will probably get lucky more often than not, statistically. So the opportunity of being the next Grenfell statistically is very low, but you need to do something to stop that. And that's what the legislation is trying to make you do. It would be really helpful if it was actually enforced.
Absolutely, and ultimately with the act in play, why take that risk anyway? You know, if you're commercially running a game of risk, whilst the odds are good, they're not perfect, and
also the regulator shouldn't let you. I used an analogy the other day. I thought about if you run a coach company. Imagine if you just sort of said to a coach operator with 25 coaches, well, you know, Ben, you're a nice guy. Go off and maintain your coaches, and then if you have an accident, we'll come and have a look because you should have made certain check. You don't. You do that, but you also have an MOT as a backstop.
Yes.
Or whatever the commercial equivalent. I think it's an MOT, but you know, you have compulsory backstop checks, and really that's what the building safety regulator is doing with BAC once every 5 years. But again, I just don't feel that that's frequent enough in terms of that sort of time between checks, and the fact that a lot of these buildings now haven't even gone through the first wave. So the vast majority haven't even seen the regulator once yet.
I'd agree. I think you've got to look at it as, you know, using the analogy of a vehicle. The vehicle is a fairly condensed risk in terms of what it is. Obviously, it moves around and things, and that changes. But with a building, there's so many moving parts. You've got change of residents. You've got change of elements of the building. You've got things that happen without people knowing about them, and things. So it's essential to keep that information current. Because actually, it doesn't take much to take a building that is safe to a building that is significantly less safe if not monitored correctly.
Yeah.
And that, for me, is the whole point of having a maintained safety case, having regular formal meetings with PAPs, APs, sometimes responsible people, and making sure that nothing's changed. And there are examples, which I won't go into directly, of situations where things get said in said meetings, and you think, well, that's been completely mismanaged. That now we need to go back and fix that.
It sounds good on the surface. I remember in a previous life where we were working with a firm of lawyers about their business continuity arrangements for another part of our business in terms of risk management, and the IT department were absolutely adamant that power supply was not a problem. They had a generator in the basement car park that could run the building for days. Fantastic. And it wasn't until we scratched it below the surface and said, oh, that's interesting. So can you show me the test and maintenance records for said generator? And about 6 weeks later, they came back very humble and sort of said, well, actually, you know, I know we said we've got a generator, but it turns out the 3 years of maintenance that was included when we bought the thing or had it installed, it went off maintenance, and procurement decided supposedly that it wasn't an important area of spend. So consequently, for another 4 years, the thing hadn't been tested or maintained. So if you'd have just taken that on face value and said, oh, great, they've got a generator, tick the box, move on, that's great. Yeah. But where is the evidence that this is being done? And it's so important to get that evidential management right. But it's probably the biggest part of this regime that's overlooked, the actual production of the evidence and the date boundaries of the evidence, and the fact that is this 6 monthly check being done every 6 months or once every 3 or 4 years or never.
Yes.
Who knows? And
then producing that, formally producing that.
At scale.
Has it been done?
Yeah.
Yes. Show me it's been done. What were the outcomes of that test? Is that maintenance upheld?
Yes.
And they're the questions that we ask. They're the questions that the platform that we use, that you provide to us, allows us to monitor that from our position as well. So we can look into that system and say, well, actually, we know that piece of equipment's there. It's a safety aspect of the building. And actually, looking at our records, it's not. We now need to go and revisit that. That becomes an agenda item on the meeting that we have with our.
And there should be multiple levels as well of if we take something like a dry riser, for example, that under the Fire Safety England regulations, there should be a monthly management inspection, a walk around the building, non-expert sort of check. So 12 times a year at minimum, we should be checking those. So if the valves have been stolen or something, there should be 12 opportunities a year to find it. Plus, we should be pressure testing it and visually inspecting it professionally every 6 months on a 12-month cycle for both of those. So that's 14 inspections, plus security guards walking around, plus whatever. There should be multiple opportunities to spot a problem and then escalate and report, whether that becomes a report into the local fire service under the FSCR or a mandatory occurrence report into the regulator, probably both in that scenario. And then there should be evidence of that on your golden thread. So, and that's just one tiny element of a building, but a very important element. And repeat.
Yeah, but it's the element, absolutely, of which there are hundreds, if not more. But for me, it's understanding or rather agreeing the mechanism for communication, for escalation, and then all the way back down. I had a conversation with a client recently, and it's a PAP with 2 APs beneath it, and one AP reports into another. And we probably should have talked about what PAPs and APs are before I tell this story, but we'll get that later. And there was an agreed route of escalation. There was an agreed reporting route, which ultimately would transition into an MOR if required. But then there was nothing to take that information back down again. And I think that was a key conversation. It's like, if something's reported by a resident, whether that resident be from the social sector or from the private sector, there needs to be a full cycle of communication there, that people know that they've been heard, that process is being dealt with, and what and how it's being dealt with. Because there's nothing more frustrating than raising something that you believe to be highly important and then hearing nothing about it. But also, because then that discourages people from doing it again.
I think Dame Judith was very clear about resident engagement and residents understanding that the part they play in building safety. They are the eyes and ears. There will be in every building, I think everybody that's responsible for running a building will know Mrs. Miggins at flat 6 or whatever doesn't miss a thing, or there's these informal networks of sort of, we call them the camp commandant or whatever you want to do, but the people that don't miss a trick, they know if something isn't working, they know within seconds. I mean, they can both be very annoying but also really useful in terms of being the eyes and ears of but if they know the importance of a piece of equipment or a system and say, well, look, if that doesn't work, that's really, really important, please report it, they will report it. So if you've got that reporting system or a complaint system or a maintenance system or whatever, the policy requirement is understanding, well, how do we recognize the importance of that problem in relation to building safety, and how do we make sure it's been properly reported and dealt with, and there's feedback that, thank you, Mrs. Miggins, we've got it, this is really important, you're amazing, here's a bunch of flowers, and we've dealt with it, it will be fixed tomorrow, etc., and if we need to update the fire brigade, we'll do that. Enshrining that and again, it's back to these policies and procedures that quite often are lacking, because it might just disappear into a black hole, or a maintenance department put it on the list and think, well, when we get back from Christmas holidays, we'll deal with it. And before you know it, a fortnight's gone past. And you better hope that there isn't a significant incident in that fortnight, because you will not be able to defend yourself if that incident is properly investigated.
Absolutely. One of the bigger problems I've come across more often than not is where you've got more than one agency on one building, and they each have their own systems, and both systems are perfectly good, but they just do not integrate. And making sure that we can work through that, and it takes a little bit of give and take from all parties.
And I think that's the role of the building safety manager as well, though, Ben, that I think the system inadvertently recognises that complexity. You talked about, so principal accountable person, a couple of accountable persons, and these are legal entities. I think we'll probably talk in more detail about that. There is a duty to cooperate, and the building safety manager's role, although they're not a legal duty holder, but there's a role there to be performed on behalf of the principal accountable person, is to glue those together, fill in the gaps, apply intelligence to the system. There won't just be a simple system that flows all the way through digitally.
Wouldn't it be nice?
There will be manual handling to do, and there will be, one of the examples I use is a new fire risk assessment comes in from the fire risk assessor. There may be elements within that fire risk assessment that have a fundamental impact on our assumptions within the building safety case, within our risk assessment or the hazards for the building. the building safety manager should spot that, see the detail, and say, actually, there's a knock-on implication here. I need to do something. And it may well be a mandatory occurrence report. It may well be adding some additional risks or changing the risk levels within the safety case report.
Yeah.
That's that human expert layer, and why this is actually a role in its own right. This is a specialist role to actually understand this regime and implement the regime properly. It's not just something that you give to somebody that is a property manager and say, there you go, you've got a couple of high risk buildings, get on with it, without any training. You're just setting yourself up to fail. Which
is a challenge in its own right, isn't it? I know you and I have had conversations away from the camera about this and the perceived reluctance for building managers or other parties to involve a consultant.
Yeah.
And we talked about the importance of the skill set of the person submitting that safety case. So, I mean, I'm biased, but naturally I agree that a purpose-made consultancy or a building management company that's got proper qualifications, experience is essential. Yeah. But how often do you see that problem? How often do you see issues where people are reluctant to spend that money, or they feel as though they can do it themselves? And where do you draw the line on that?
All the time, really. I think one of the issues is if we look at, that's not such a thing, but let's say an average organisation had 20 higher risk buildings. They were split down into tranches for being called forward by the regulator for the assessment process. So let's say, for example, you had 2 of your 20 in the first tranche and 18 that were spread out over the following 4 tranches. What happened is that everybody worked on the 2 that were going to get called forward first. And when you're working on 1 or 2, you can work around with Word documents, Excel spreadsheets, dysfunction everywhere, because you can sort of find stuff. If the homework had been do 20 at the same time and manage 20 at the same time, the need for expert help, the need for systems would be so much greater. But that's not the way that the regulator chose to go about its business. So we're very much at the early stage at the moment, and most people are in either we haven't done this yet, we're giving it a bit of a go, or we've done 1 or 2 of 20 or 30, rather than we're up and running with 55, everything's in place, every safety case report's written, every golden thread is populated, we're business as usual. And we've got a few clients like that, especially a few councils that literally have got every single building done, every safety case report written and being iterated as things change. And again, then they're never finished. They're always a work in progress.
Yeah.
They're always changing. They're dynamic. But version 1 has been written, and some of them are on version 12 and others are on version 2. And the golden threads are being populated and ever expanded as they learn more about the building. But if you were to go back and say, show me where you were 6 months ago, they could say, here's all of our safety case reports from 6 months ago and our golden thread as at 6 months ago. And here it is today, and look how it's changed.
Look how it's grown, yeah.
Yeah, but there are very few that I would say that are in that situation. Most of them are still at the foothills of this regime.
Yeah, which to some degree is expected. But let's talk about, we talked about consequence earlier, or the lack of at the moment, but ultimately, what could happen if you've not got your ducks in a row? What would if someone's watching this now and if they own a number of HRBs and they think, oh, I fall into the latter part of that. I've got an idea, I've not quite started it. Who do I speak to? What do I do? Or let's have a go at it myself. If the doorbell was rang now, what would they expect to hear from the regulator?
So from a Building Safety Act perspective, depending on the transgression, the ultimate sanction is an unlimited fine and prison, or prison.
Quite serious.
Very serious, yeah. But the prison side of things is difficult because the regulated entity is a legal entity as opposed to a natural person. So you're then starting to look at sort of personal liability within a corporate conduct, sort of corporate manslaughter, those sorts of things. The unlimited fine is an unlimited fine. There are individuals within the regime, a lot of them that are board directors of resident management companies who are effectively amateur property managers, if you like. They are there by being a shareholder or being a director of the company that manages their building or owns their building. They're a leaseholder. So they are hugely exposed, and don't have. There is a legal mechanism to sidestep liability, but it's never been codified in regulation. So whether you could rely on it or not, all the lawyers that I've consulted with have said, do not go anywhere near the relying on a paid building safety director as a means of sidestepping liability. But again, this is all theoretical liability because it hasn't, as far as I'm aware, happened yet to anybody. But it is a potential liability. That's what the law says.
Still not a risk I would want to take.
No. And then you've got your health and safety law and all the other, regulatory reform, fire safety order, all the other ways of being taken through the courts on top of this.
So let's stick with that then. So, you've got that group of people there that we talk about, that some of which might not even realise they're accountable. I think what's probably important at this juncture is to discuss the role of a PAP, who a PAP is, who an AP is, their roles and responsibilities. We know PAPs as principal accountable people or person, APs as an accountable person.
Yeah.
Generalising through the industry, for those who don't know, how would you allocate those roles to, say, a property owner with 3 HRBs, for argument's sake, and how they run those buildings on the daily?
So to answer the first bit of the question, the Building Safety Act runs on the accountable person regime, not responsible persons, which you would get under the fire safety order.
Yes.
So at some points, for example, a managing agent could be the responsible person, but they're not the accountable person under the Building Safety Act. The lead accountable person is the principal accountable person. So if there is only one accountable person responsible for a building, they are effectively the principal accountable person. If there's more than one accountable person, then the one that leads is the principal accountable person.
Yes.
And the way that they lead is by being responsible ultimately for the fabric, the external wall and roof of the building, if you like. So that in the context of a freeholder, for example, with a couple of long leases let to housing association and a private resident management company or something like that, then the PAP would be the freeholder typically, and then the private resident management company and the housing association would be accountable persons. The principal accountable person is the one that's responsible for submission of the safety case report, mandatory occurrence report, reporting system, the resident engagement strategy, and is the lead contact and responsible entity with the regulator. The accountable persons underneath have a duty of cooperation and information sharing, which is regulated, but they don't take the lead. So if you interrogate the public HRB register, you will see that. If you look up a building, you will see who the principal accountable person is, what they're responsible for, and then accountable persons if they're registered underneath. And it will vary from building to building, from lease to lease, and is a designation that people are still arguing over now as to whether they are legally responsible or not. Is the building in scope or not? These are all outstanding questions that are still being had years into the new regime. I
think what's probably most important for anyone that happens to be listening to this podcast that's not fully aware of their liabilities is to reach out to the Fortison Charter, reach out to you, Matt. We'll put some links at the bottom of this podcast, and we're more than happy to answer those questions and give people the guidance that they need.
It's still happening daily. Is this gallery floor in this converted brewery a story or not? If it is a story, then it's an HRB. If it's not, it's not. And one professional advisor is saying it is, one saying it's not. And then, what do we think? And then ultimately, if these issues can't be resolved, they need to then go to the first tier tribunal probably for adjudication, so you're then into a legal battle. And we spend a lot of time helping people take buildings out of scope and also putting buildings into scope. Yeah. My view is it needs to be right. There's we don't want a whole bunch of buildings in there that shouldn't be. And similarly, it's really bad if we've got buildings in scope that are missing from registration.
They're missing, absolutely. We talk about the golden thread and the formation of the golden thread, and there's a podcast to be had, I think, on doing that within the construction phase, preoccupation, But let's talk about the golden thread, its importance post-occupation on a change of use building, or on something where a building management company's come into play after the fact, and then the benefit of a comprehensive building safety case for a building management company or person that doesn't necessarily have that construction knowledge.
Yeah.
How what do you think the benefits and pitfalls are in that situation?
I think that one of the key problems can be that obviously through that construction phase, there's a lot of very highly skilled technical people writing technical specifications, keeping construction records, etc. And then you move into an occupation regime where you've got perhaps people that are not as technically skilled, or won't be as technically skilled on the construction side, but are very skilled in the management of residents and what residents do within buildings. And I think there's that handoff is pretty clunky in terms of, here's a massive information that you probably don't understand, quoting British standards all over the place. And then there's the reality of what goes on within the building. And I think that's another key role for a building safety manager, is to bridge that divide. And I think that's probably why I get drawn to it, because although I have the construction background, I was never either bright enough or committed enough to do one thing for long enough to become truly expert in it, right? So I know enough to be dangerous about the process, but not enough to be competent.
With you.
And similarly, I've been exposed enough to what goes on within buildings and how people live in buildings and how they occupy them. So I think you can kind of translate both of those environments into what will or won't work. That, as an aside, was one of the key things that was missing out of Dame Judith Hackett's work, was a lack of understanding about how people actually live in buildings and how leasehold works and how multi-occupancy living actually works in the real world. It was very much a theoretical exercise.
Yeah.
People do smash holes in things. People do change things. People do stupid things. Yeah. They ride on shoulders in nightclubs with sprinklers. And, our job is to make sure we don't provide them with combustible ceilings in those sorts of environments, because people do stupid things. That's life. But I'm not sure that your average construction worker building a high-risk block would necessarily instinctively think about how people behave when they're designing to a code, but they're looking to meet regulations, functional requirements, etc., and quality, which is great. But we need to make sure that that's preserved, and I think that's where those ongoing risk assessments and reviews work. But I think also those property managers need to be upskilled as well in terms of, what is compartmentation? How do these systems work? What happens when they don't work? So I think it's blending those, and that's what I see a building safety manager.
Yeah, mediation / translation, and you find yourself doing that inherently when you're talking to people, because should I say often, and I'm glad when people do this. People say, "I've got a silly question." You haven't. If you think it's a silly question, it means you don't quite understand it. That's fine. Let's talk about how important it is, because it could be something like compartmentation. It could be the simplest thing. Flat 17 has come down and told me they've put a massive TV on the wall and they've cut all the plasterboard out of it. And you think, well, hang on a minute, that is a compartmentation firewall that separates the corridor from the dwelling, and that's massive.
Yes. In
terms of how that building operates or doesn't operate, and the potential for internal spread of flame, etc., so on and so forth. So what might seem a relatively simple thing, or an annoyance, if you will, or they shouldn't have done that goes against the lease agreement, from a building safety management perspective, is quite a major event. And I think that's the importance of taking construction-based knowledge and integrating that into real world problems, which is essentially what you've just said.
Yeah. How is this built? What was the method? How finely engineered is it? Have we got 6 layers of plasterboard there rather than 2? What type of plasterboard? That kind of thing. What would be the impact of cutting that television into the wall? Mm-hmm. Because the likelihood is people are going to do it. Sure as eggs, they're going to do things. They are going to light barbecues on their balconies. They are going to do all of these things that they're going to light sprinklers in a nightclub. This stuff is going to happen. What's the potential consequence of that happening? Yeah. What will they? Thinking back to a fire a couple of years ago where flat fire took place. That in the hallway, a broom fell over and it basically stopped the fire door from shutting as the guy left the flat. Cue smoke logging of corridors. Well, where is the extraction from the corridor, because I think that's a likely consequence of a flat fire, smoke escaping into a corridor, escape corridor. So we need to make sure we understand that, and we've got the ability to try and clear the corridor. So it's about those overlapping systems and the failure modes, that not everybody will diligently shut their front door if they have a fire in their flat.
Yeah.
One other one I'm thinking of, the guy had a cat, couldn't find the cat, so he blocked the door open of the flat that was on fire just in case the cat needed to escape.
It happens all the time. People moving big bits of furniture, whatever. You can't predict the timing of an event.
Yeah.
And as you say, there are overlaps in safety mechanisms.
Well, the law of sod will dictate that that will happen at the most inappropriate time.
I agree entirely.
Yeah.
But it's been able to manage it. So going back to the golden thread then, on that basis, key information for an example such as that is, one, are the fire doors the right fire door? Are they self-closing? Have we managed as reasonably practicable that those doors should be closed? But in the event they're open, have you got mechanical extraction? Are the AOVs in place? Are they functional? When were they tested? Were any faults found?
Yes.
And then you factor in the human inspection regime, so the management company. Were any doors left open? Has there been any damaged doors? Has the wind caught one? And all of a sudden you start building these layers of protection, which essentially sit within this golden thread. And again, not to reiterate too strongly, but being able to manage and educate people that have less construction knowledge as the importance of those elements is a primary role of a building safety manager.
Yeah, and I think people understanding the Swiss cheese model of a disaster. That you've got the sort of, you imagine the slices of cheese. So a problem coming in, slices of cheese, but it's Swiss, it's got holes in it. What you want is, you don't want the holes lining up, because that thing gets through from one side to the other. So having those multiple layers of defence there, well, okay, somebody did leave the door open, but the AOV system was properly designed. It enacted as it should. It cleared the smoke to a degree. The fire service did their part. They got there quickly. When they got there, the dry riser was functional because that had been tested,
they knew where they were going.
etc. Yeah, they knew where they were going because of the proper plans and the secure information box. Multiple layers of defence that should avoid the major consequence. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about a silver bullet, which is, we don't have to worry about anything because this building's got sprinklers in it, for example. It's another layer of defence, and it's about understanding through the development of the safety case what brings those risks to a tolerable level. Did we take all reasonable steps?
Yes.
Which is what the law says, to manage that risk, and how do we prove we took all reasonable steps? And that also includes narrating what were deemed to be unreasonable and why. So it doesn't mean to say you've got to do everything, but if you're not going to do something, make sure you document why you didn't do it.
Give a good reason as to why not.
Yeah.
Let's just talk about people that might have a safety case. It's a point in time. It's a single document. It's essentially expired as far as we're concerned. But there might be a group of people out there that go, well, I've done my bit. I've got a safety case. Let's just, for argument's sake, say it was done in summer last year. What would your advice be to those people in terms of saying, well, hang on a minute. Yeah, you have done your bit, but technically that's expired. Let's talk about a mechanism for those people to come and say, well, I need to convert this into a live document.
Yeah.
How important is that? And what's your recommendation along those lines?
So the requirement is that it needs to be living, breathing, and really that's living and breathing, because the underlying evidence will constantly be going out of date because we're renewing things quarterly, monthly, annually, whatever. Making sure that ties into the golden thread and that it is keeping pace with mandatory occurrences, complaints, resident engagement. So effectively all of the component parts of that report are changing and churning all the time. So what we would do with clients like that and working with people like yourselves is actually turn that into a data-driven environment of both golden thread and safety case report with versioning, so that, and then forcing dates of formal reviews, so sort of saying, well, in the last 3 months, has anything changed? Let's sign off on the fact that either it has or it hasn't. So if it has, it's been updated and reversioned. If it hasn't, it gets pushed out again. And then where there are meaningful changes to that report, the fact that that's provided to the regulator, and just making sure that somebody is looking and managing that program, which is entirely different to having a a PDF document that's provided to you by a consultant, and then they've gone off to the next job. It's a way of life. It's not just a one-hit piece of reporting.
Couldn't agree more. I think, thinking about these sort of quarterly meeting agendas and things like that, without that current information, without the ability to check systems in a live or semi-live format, there's so much risk attracted rather by that scenario that it's almost untenable. It doesn't make any sense to me.
And there will be surveys and inspections along the way that may throw up something that you didn't know, and that fundamentally changes the risk of the building, and that has to be responded to in the safety case. And the process for doing that needs to be there. And I just don't understand how anybody can say that they're compliant with the Building Safety Act if they've just got a sort of a historical document as a PDF that was written a year, 6 months, however long ago, and isn't being constantly reviewed.
I think that's a really important message to leave here in this. And so I think what I would say at this point is that if someone's got let's call it a static safety case, that's older than a week, then they need to do something about that. If they've not started, the fundamental message is do something. The fundamental message is understand what your risks are, speak to somebody, get the ball rolling, start to reduce it, make that job smaller, and we're happy to help with that.
Yep. Just start and keep it going.
Just do it.
Yeah.
Just do it. It's not going to go away, is it?
No.
Matt, if we were to give some advice to PAPs, APs, based on sort of 30, 60 and 90 days from this moment now, cold start, what would your advice be?
Wow, that's a good question.
It's a big question.
So the immediate actions: one, understand your role. What is your legal role, and what's the legal role of the duty holding around you? Check on the HRB register that your building is correctly registered with the correct entities, and that your key building information that is also uploaded to the regulator is correct. And then start assembling your golden thread and writing your safety case report as a result. Now, it may well be that the golden thread is not particularly golden to start with. It might be brown, silver, gold, whatever. So it may have a lot of gaps. It may have a lot of out-of-date information, but start sourcing all of that compliance information, if you like, evidence of doing stuff. You might not necessarily know how it's going to hang together into a safety case narrative at the moment, but bring it all in. You know you're testing things. Get the evidence of those tests being done, for example, construction information, get that in, plans, get it together, organise it on a system like ours if you can, or just at the start, just find it, call it in from your contractors and agents, etc. And then start writing that narrative of the safety case reports. So start sort of documenting what you think the key risks are in the building. Have you got the right people with the right skills to actually give you input into that process? So if you've got somebody on the team, for example, that is a electrician, is it right that they're necessarily inputting into the structural risk assessment for the building, or would you be better placed to have a structural engineer advising you on that? I would certainly go with the structural engineer. Yeah. So you do have to prove to the regulator that you've got competent people working on that safety case production and that risk assessment. And then really start as you sort of work through. I think if you can get the basic information together in 30 days, you're doing really well. I would say to get to version 1 of safety case, you're probably looking more at that 90-day period in terms of actually having something that hangs together. In the way that we do it as a series, web-based, but as the report comes from basically answering lots of questions and filling in lots of boxes of information and writing in narratives. Then ultimately, when you hit the publish button, produces the safety case report itself. And I think speak to colleagues, speak to advisors, learn, and just really start thinking around, if I couldn't speak to a court or a regulator and that all they could judge me on was reading this document, does this tell the right story? And when you're telling a story, it needs to be a real story that's evidentially based, yes, not a tool story that is what you think you should be doing or what you think they would want to hear, because they will investigate it if they need to. And if you've told them you're doing something that you don't do, that's really problematic. What you should be doing is telling them what you do now and what you plan to do and when you plan to do that by. And then you can't be held liable for telling the regulator you're doing something, or kidding yourself, because people might often think that, they pick that up and they go, well, Matt said he does X. Great. They're already doing that. And actually, I was planning to do X, but I haven't got around to doing it yet.
It's an important point, isn't it? Sorry to interject, but do you think there's an element of that? Do you think a lot of people are trying to get their ducks in a row before they start the process, and actually that could really inhibit their position?
Yes, and I've seen it a lot with outsourced safety case reports that are just point-in-time reports where they're built from a template by a consulting company. They normally refer to the management of the building as the client does X. Well, sorry guys, the safety case report is the work of the PAP. They may have outsourced the production of it, but it's in first person. Mm-hmm. As the PAP, I do this or we do this. And quite often it's wishful thinking of, this is what you should be doing, because of course the law says you need to do this, but the reality is, unless that can be evidence, we need to assume that it's not being done. So in my world, I always assume that nothing's being done until it can be proved that it is.
Yeah.
And that's the key difference, because I can't rely on that in court. And I don't want to be responsible or involved in producing a document or a statement that isn't factually correct. Yeah. So unless I've seen the evidence, it goes in as a future action rather than a current action.
Yeah, statements and opinions don't count.
Correct.
Evidence does.
Yes.
Because ultimately that's what you're going to be judged on.
Yes.
Really interesting. I think, we shamelessly want to plug the fact that we can help with a lot of these issues. I think if people are confused, I would urge you, rather than not do something, speak to someone like us. By all means, speak to us. Yeah. I know I'm more than happy to help. I'm sure you are too, because ultimately, based on conversations we've had today and based on conversations we've had over weeks and months prior to this, I can wholeheartedly say that our primary role in this is to make buildings safer, to keep residents safe. It's something that I'm passionate about, and I know you are too. So thanks for sharing all that you have with us today. It's been really insightful. I feel like there's so much more to talk about, and I'm sure that we will again. But really, just to sign off and say that, if anyone needs any software solutions, speak to Matt. In terms of golden thread formation, in terms of building safety cases, and in any other capacity, but also speak to us if you've got any questions. We're happy to get this across the board and make sure you get the best possible outcome for your building and for your residents. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thanks
for
having me.
Really appreciate it.